So my horror background, being a Christian, is a little bit different. It's one of those things where I look in retrospect, like we were talking about earlier. Uh, the irony of the Jack Chick tracks is that the '80s Baptist church would have been very frowning on horror, but what were the Jack Chick tracks? They were horror. I mean, they were hell and damnation. This is going to happen to you. Let me try to scare you so you can. As a Christian, I would have to say there is a lot of subconscious tension between my faith and liking all of this stuff, all through high school, all through college. Just because, I went to a small Baptist church, and it was a good church. A lot of people have horror stories about their Baptist church. I don't. Were there a lot of things that probably happened behind closed doors that were not that good? I'm sure. That happens in every church.
Yep.
But I don't have
that happens in every group.
Any group with people. Anywhere.
Yep. Anytime there's a group of people, it's going to happen.
So I don't have any horror stories about that. I will say, as a high school student, though, and junior high student, I didn't identify as a horror fan. Although it was weird, I loved scary stories to tell by the campfire. I loved checking out books that were ghost stories. I love the Hardy Boys, what are the Hardy Boys? But the Hardy Boys are all natural gothics. They're Scooby-Doo stories. This looks supernatural. We're going to explain it by the end of the story. But none of that stuff I classified as horror, So I don't think I realized how my faith could coincide with horror, ironically enough, until about my mid-20s. And the novel that did this for me it wasn't the Left Behind series. I had read the Left Behind series. They were okay.
I've actually never read it.
Yeah. They're okay. I would say the Left Behind series got to a point where you're like, okay, we're dragging this out to sell more books.
Yep.
The novel, ironically enough, that really validated my feelings that being a Christian and liking horror is okay is the novel Desperation by Stephen King. And if you know Stephen King, I don't think Stephen King considers himself a Christian, but he's never been able to get rid of that Methodist upbringing. That Methodist upbringing is still very ingrained.
There's a strong moral thing. Even when people are breaking their moral boundaries, it's written that to show they're breaking moral boundaries.
And some people have called Stephen King one of the last great moralists. But anyway, so in Desperation, one of the characters in flashback is a Catholic priest who's ministering to this young boy about faith. And yes, it's an R-rated novel. There's sexually graphic stuff in there. There's violence. There's gore. But the underlying thread about this character's grappling with God is God merciful? Is God love? Is God justice? Is God this or that? Well, really, I walked away from that novel thinking, okay, I don't know what Stephen King's thoughts are as a Christian, but for me as a Christian, this novel really engaged me not only on the suspense level, but now I'm thinking all of these deep thoughts about what is the nature of God. And for me as a Christian, and I was probably like 22, 23 years old, I was really thinking, wow, this is a work of secular horror, and it's engaging me on a theological level. And the next novel that did that, coincidentally, is The Stand by Stephen King. Because The Stand is a secular novel that has Christian theology as its bare bones throughout the whole novel.
And one thing I think is interesting, if you've never been a Christian, you pick up on the lingo. Like when you're reading a book or you're listening to a song from an artist who has a Christian background, you pick up on certain word usage, I will say. I've had songs I'm listening to, and I'm like, I'm going to bet that artist is a Christian, or at least grew up a Christian, because there's certain word you pick up on the language. And almost 100%, I would say, if not 100% of the time, you're like, yep, I called it. You pick up on that. You do pick up the moralism of Stephen King. There's that influence in the background.
Yep.
I don't know what his history is and how much time he spent in church and stuff like that, but you can tell that influence showed up into there. Yep. Now, the key is for writing a general market, it shouldn't be a secret language that you have to understand. Mm-hmm. And actually, you try to be aware of that as a writer to not try to isolate your audience.
Right.
It needs to be a story that everyone can appreciate, and it needs to be a story that everyone can understand the moral dilemmas on it.
Right.
But some of the word choice, I wouldn't be surprised if people pick up on, like, oh yeah, you grew up as a Christian in like the 90s and stuff like that, because just the influence of your language. But that's actually the fun thing. I mean, if Christianity is such a common thing in American culture, we kind of don't classify as a culture, but we also pick up words from other cultures, other countries, other religions that show up in there, and you pick up on the cultural aspect of it just because it's not maybe heard as often in America.
Right.
But it's still a culture aspect, and it's kind of neat to see that. I love actually seeing the influence of different cultures show up in the author's fiction. So, okay. But you bring up that aspect of horror. Actually, I would say one of the earliest book series that pushed me towards horror, and it wasn't supposed to, the Cooper Kids Adventure books. And if Christians will remember it, others won't. It was written by Frank Peretti, who has written Christian horror.
Frank Peretti is like a classic Christian horror.
He's one of the very few Christian authors who's gotten, I guess, the cultural permission to write horror. Yes. And he wrote a kid's book, and it was very... I later on in life, in middle school, I hooked on to Michael Crichton. And it's a good comparison. It's very Michael Crichton-esque, where the kids and the family get put into a perilous situation, and they're trying to get their way out of it, whether they're trapped under sea, trapped in an ancient Greek maze. There was a sense of peril, that suspense and danger. Reading as a kid, I was actually drawn to that. It was supposed to be a Christian book, but really it was that danger and the peril and a sense of terror at they're going through. That's what I actually hooked onto when I read those books, and I remember those books because of it. Later on, I'm reading Edgar Allan Poe, I'm reading Michael Crichton, and then I'm going on to horror authors like Stephen King. That sense of terror in the story has always been a draw to me. Things that, you want the enemy that's there to be legitimately dangerous because you want to see heroes go through it. And oftentimes, your everyday heroes. I want to see your struggling normal person push through it. And I'm still reading those kind of stories, just at a more mature level now. But that's always been that draw to me. So it's interesting to see how much of it is I grew into a horror fan, and how much of it I just naturally was designed that way. That kind of story has always drawn me.
Yep, absolutely.